So, the women.
The lionesses, yeah.
So the lionesses have won. So myself and my missus there at the back, Simone, she was shouting at the TV even louder than me. That's why she's not up here presenting. But I don't know. Normally when I run these at home, we always run a prize for the person who's travelled the furthest to get it. Well, that's me. So we aren't going to do that today. But if you have you travelled further than me?
I'll come from Northampton.
All right, okay. Okay, now if you pick up this little leaflet, you still have one of these, yeah. And if you see on the back of it, there is the Fuller's cartouche on there, and you see that the symbol of Fuller's Brewery is the griffin. Okay, now we picked the griffin as the symbol of our brewery for a particular reason. The griffin in mythology is the guardian of treasure. Okay, and that is why that lady griffin has her paw on a barrel of beer, because she is guarding Fuller's treasure, which is of course our beer. Yeah, I did say something there that the alert amongst you might have picked up. I did call her a lady griffin. Yeah, how do I know that's a lady griffin? You're not answering, Simon. Can anybody tell me why? Nobody want to make any rude comments at this moment? Lady griffins have wings. Male griffins do not have wings. Okay? So, not only are you learning about beer, but you're learning about mythology as well. Okay? So, Fuller's was formed way back in 1845 as Fuller, Smith and Turner. There was brewing going on the site since 1600 and something. So it's not always been Fuller's Brewery. It's based in Chiswick, which is in west of London. And if you're coming out of the centre of London, you come out past Kensington, past Hammersmith, into Chiswick. Yeah? And if you continue past Chiswick, you end up at Heathrow Airport. Okay? So if you get a taxi from Heathrow, the taxi will drive you past the brewery.
Or to the brewery.
Or to the brewery if you insist. Yeah? So we are quite a famous landmark in west of London. And we are, of course, the Queen's favourite brewery. That's a lie. I don't know. I have never actually met the Queen. Shelf life. I have no idea how old this actually was. It tastes okay. It tastes fresh to me. But I always, the bottling process is quite a traumatic process. So I always say a bottled beer is at its best between 3 weeks old and 3 months old. 3 weeks just to get over that initial problem, and then 3 months before oxidation starts to come in, yeah, and starts producing more negative flavors. So that's where I think it's at its best. However, the bottle condition beers and the vintages of bottle condition beers, you will find it's last 10 years because it's still got that yeast in. That yeast mops up a lot of the oxygen and really slows down the oxidation factors. So instead of being negative, a lot of those oxidation flavors become positive. They become Madeira and sherry-like instead of that sort of papery and cardboardy flavor you get from normal quick oxidation. Okay.
Can you talk about the recipe on this?
The recipe on the ESB. ESB is produced on a party gyle with London Pride and with Chiswick and with Golden Pride on the rare occasions we produce Golden Pride, which is our barley wine. Yeah? And so they all have the same recipe, which is we would use pale ale malt at about 95-96% pale ale malt. Then there's about 4% crystal malt and 50 kilos in a big brew of 640 barrels of chocolate malt, just to give it an extra bit of colour. Yeah, so that is the malt recipe. Then Target is used as the main bitterness hop, and then for the Lake Copper hop, which we add 2 minutes from the end of the boil, we would use Northdown, Challenger and Goldings. to give it its real big hop character. Also for ESB, we would dry hop in tank as well with Goldings. Yeah, so it gets dry hopped in tank before it gets filtered and then put on. But I did say we produce on Partigal. Probably you don't understand what Partigal is. Partigal is a Victorian system of making beer. It's the most efficient use you can have of mash tuns as opposed to lauter tuns or mash filters. Mash tuns are the traditional way of producing British style beers, and it's a very calm mashing system. So you mix the grain together with the water, the liquor, brewing, we call mashing water liquor, and we mix it in, and then we let it stand in the mash tun, and the grain bed will float, yeah, because of the entrapped air that goes into the grist, yeah, and it will make it float. And then after an hour's stand, during which all the conversion has taken place, all the starch has been converted to sugar, you then need to wash it out by sparging on top and drawing from underneath. And you draw in a balanced way, so you never sparge quicker and draw off slower. You always do it in a balanced way, so it always stays floating. And that means the wort underneath is very clear, yeah, and that makes the best cask beer because it makes the clearest cask beer. And that's why we as British brewers prefer a mashing system to a lauter tun, which rakes the bed and therefore disturbs the bed and therefore transfers cloudy wort. And therefore that is why lager producers who use lauter have to lager in order to clarify beer. Lagering was not brought in for flavour purposes, it was brought in for clarity purposes. Then they found out it had flavour purposes, but it was not brought in for that. And it's the same as when they used to boil, and they used to take a third out of the boil it and raise the temperature when they were mashing, yeah? That was done because they could not heat properly, right? And then they found that had a flavour purpose as well. So everything was done for practical reasons, not thinking about flavour, and then they became used to having the flavour produced by that process, which was essentially brought in for practical reasons. But what a Partigal system was, we would mash in 2 mash tuns together, we would run them off together into the first copper. When the first copper was full, we would then run into the second copper from the mash tuns. Consequently, the first copper is always very strong and the second copper is always very weak. We then blend them into fermenting vessel disproportionately. So ESB, which was 5.5%, got more first wort than second wort from the second copper. London Pride, which is 4%, got roughly even. And Chiswick Bitter, which is 3.5%, got more of the second wort than the first wort. And that's how we produced 3 different beers from the one recipe.
Take that one.
We produced this porter as a recipe in about 1996 as a homage to the porters we used to produce. And if you look back at the history of porter grew out of really brown ale, and that was produced with brown malt because they couldn't make pale malt in those days. But as soon as they started making pale malt, everybody switched to using pale malt because it had more sugar in it, therefore you got greater volume of beer. And how you would make porters then is add darker malts to it for the flavouring purposes. So the recipe of this is more a homage to that type of London porter. Now, the recipe is about 80% pale malt, 10% crystal, 10% brown. We also add a little bit of chocolate to add to the colour. And we use all Fuggles as hops. Yeah? And we don't late copper hop it. We just put the hops in at the beginning.
They're no Partigal.
It's not Partigaled either. Nope. We used to Partigal our dark beers, but we don't make enough dark beers to Partigal them. Now, I don't know if you know the origins of porter, but porter was originated in London. It was a London drink, and it was the world's most popular beer. And London at that point was the first city really to industrialise brewing. And because of that, they had a lot of spare capacity to make beer, which they then exported around the world. Famously to the Baltic states, and that's why you have a famous drink called Baltic Porter, right? And also to Ireland. And the Irish loved this beer so much that they asked their brewers to start making London Porter. But unfortunately for the Irish brewers, they could not afford the roasted malts that go into this. So they said to their maltsters, can you just take the barley and roast it, don't malt it. So the Irish brewers used roasted barley instead of roasted malt because it was cheaper. Yeah? And that made the beer drier. The London porters were sweeter and maltier because they used malt. And that's why this porter is sweeter than your porter, because you've used roasted barley. Now, all that means is the next time you see an Irishman drinking a pint of Guinness, just say to him, you know, you're drinking a cheap version of London beer. 1845, we were celebrating our 150th anniversary. So we wanted to make a beer to do that, and we wanted again to pay a homage to the past. Later on, when I became brewing director, we started making beers that were exact copies of recipes from the past, and that was a real enjoyable experience for us. The first one we ever made was a beer called XX. You know, you can say what you like about beers from the 1800s, but they had great marketing departments who come up with super names. XX is a great name for a beer. And then they called one XXX, and they called one just plain X as well. but yeah, we got this beer XX, and we got all the right ingredients to make it. And we were going to use Goldings because Goldings has been around for a couple of 100 years, so we knew we were okay on that. We're going to brew it in exactly the same place it was brewed, right? But the oldest barley variety we could get hold of then was a barley variety called Marisotta, right? And Marisotta was developed in the 1960s. So it really wasn't something from the 1880s. Then our maltsters, Simpsons, who we're great friends with, found a farmer still growing Plumage Archer. And this idiot farmer was still growing this barley variety, which was from 1905. So he said, right, we'll have 20 tons of that. So we bought all these 20 tons of it. So that is why I'm so grateful to Prince Charles for having grown that for us. He was that idiot farmer.
Did he charge you more than for Marisotta?
He always charges top dollar.
Not such an idiot.
No, he was right. And so we went to great lengths to produce our copies of beers. And we found when we produced this, we got Ron Pattinson involved in doing it with us. And we found that in those days, the Fuller's mash tun did not have sparge arms, right? What they used to do is mash in, draw the wort off, flood, draw the wort off again, flood, and then they had a watering can, sprinkle water on top. And that's how they did it. So we said, well, that's the way we're going to do it. The computer said no. So we had to switch the computer off. Yeah, we had to switch the computer off in order to make it. But I mentioned that because, again, when we come to make 1845, we wanted to use a malt from the past called amber malt. And no British maltings at that point in time, 1995, was making amber malt. Nobody was making amber malt anymore. Simpsons agreed to make amber malt for this brew. So that's why I'm grateful to Simpsons. We also, by the way, I bought from 8 different maltsters, not just Simpsons. I bought from Crisp, Munton and Fisons, Paul's, Fawcett's, you name it. I bought from 8 British maltsters. And the reason I did that is I got 8 bottles of whiskey at Christmas. Could have bought from one maltster, and I got 1 bottle. So we made was in 1997, and you can still buy bottles of the 1997.
How much are they?
They're about 300, 400 pounds a bottle. So yeah.
A bargain now. Since
Bargain.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
You couldn't get any of those.
Don't I know? Jeez.
You couldn't get any of those shipped out.
We have few. I think we've only got about 20 bottles left in the brewery. So, and the price goes up. The rarer it becomes. We don't particularly want to sell them, so we put the price up. Yeah. So we use them for tastings. But the vintage ale concept was that we would brew a special version of our barley wine every year. And the way we would make it special is we would change slightly the ingredients. So we would use a different barley variety. We would use different hops. We would use the same yeast. But we would introduce a new ingredient to the beer. And that was the ingredient of time. Yeah? We allowed these beers to mature. So before we even bottle it, it's 3 months old. Yeah? Then we bottle it and we'd say, I would say when the fresh one comes out, and they're about £6 or £7 a bottle when they come out, buy 64 bottles of them, drink them every 3 months, and tell me how they mature. Write me a letter. Yeah? I'd be delighted to receive one. But it is that value of time, and they change immeasurably in flavour during a period of time. When we did the first vertical we ever did of Fuller's Vintage, which is about 2005, so 2006, so we had 7 or 8 of these beers, and there was one year we asked people to rank it, and one year was consistently ranked bottom of the list in 8th place by all, and we had 50 beer writers to our event.
And Ron was there too, probably.
Ron wasn't at the first, no, but Michael Jackson was there. And,
Not the Michael Jackson you may be thinking of.
Michael Jackson was a beer writer and a whiskey writer, and he said the funniest thing that ever happened to him was that in the States a series of liquor stores said, we want you to choose some whiskies for us, right, and we want you to come and we'll advertise them in our shop and we'll pay you for it and all that. He went to one of these shops and it said, try Michael Jackson's selection of 12-year-olds.
Somebody did not think about that one.
So, right, and then we saw, okay, 6 months later, we repeated the tasting with nearly all the same beer writers, and they voted this beer top. So in 6 months, it gone from bottom to top.
And what was
Just
the age?
amazing.
What was the age of that beer?
What it was about 3 years old originally, and it was coming up 4 years old when we retasted it. But I've since we now taste them on a regular basis. I personally think they're at their peak when they're about 10 years old. At that first tasting, we had no 10-year-olds. Yeah. So I think they're more at their peak when they're 10, 11, 12 years old. They're at a peak. And what it is, they don't rise to a peak and they don't fall off a peak. They rise to a peak, come down a peak, rise to another peak. and it's like a sine wave. It's not like a straight line, right? And if you think about biology, biology is about cycles. It is not about straight lines. And what happens is within this beer, there's a complexity of flavors, yeah? And as it ages, those flavors change. And sometimes it changes to a positive flavor, and sometimes it changes to a negative flavor. And it's the balance between enough positives and enough negatives that give the beer its particular taste at that point. And when the positives are in full bloom, that's when it's at a peak. And that could be 3 years. Now, this beer is just a year or so old, but what happens with it, the bitterness falls off during the first year, yeah, and the beer becomes sweeter. But over a period of 3 years, that sweetness changes because there's still reactions going on in the beer, and the sugars are breaking down and changing. Some complex sugars are becoming slightly simpler, and the yeast is still there, and it's changing them, and it's helping change those sugars, and it's mopping up oxygen. And so you get a variety of changes. So I don't know if you've heard of like the melanoidin reaction, which is a reaction between amino acid and sugars. That is a never-ending reaction. It does not stop. So when a beer is 20 years old, that reaction is still happening. And that is why the 20-year-old one is 2 degrees darker in colour than when it was first brewed, because of that reaction. Yeah? And if that reaction is changing the colour, it's changing the flavour. So, and again, it depends on your own personal taste, what flavours you prefer within that beer. And that's why it's very much in your taste that decides whether you like it or not.